In 1879, a bridge engineer named Charles Shaler Smith stood at the bottom of a granite chasm in Colorado and was handed a problem that should have been impossible. He was to carry a railroad track through the Royal Gorge, where the walls of solid rock rise more than 1,000 feet straight up, and the canyon floor pinches down to barely 30 feet across. The Arkansas River already filled that floor. There was no ground left to build on. Two railroad companies were at war over this exact strip of stone, with hired gunmen and stone forts and rifles. And the answer Smith gave them is still hanging over the water today. I've been reading the old engineering reports and the railroad histories of the Royal Gorge War, and I want to start with the two men whose names the record actually kept, because most of the men who hung this railroad over the river were never written down at all. The first is Charles Shaler Smith. Everyone who knew him called him C. Shaler Smith. He was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1836. His father died when he was a boy, and his mother died when he was 16, and that was the end of his schooling. He learned engineering the hard way, out in the open, walking survey lines as a rodman, carrying the measuring rod for older men in the mining country around Lake Superior. He worked his way up under a famous bridge engineer named Albert Fink on the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. He served as a captain of engineers through the Civil War. And by 1879, he was 43 years old and one of the most respected bridge builders in the country. 2 years before the Royal Gorge, he had thrown a cantilever railroad bridge across the Kentucky River, 275 feet above the water, the first great cantilever railroad bridge in America. So when a railroad needed a man who could put a track where no track could go, they sent for Smith. That Kentucky River Bridge is worth pausing on, because it tells you how Smith's mind worked. It was built for the Cincinnati Southern Railway in 1876 and 1877, carrying a railroad some 275 feet above the river on a deep limestone gorge. Rather than try to raise scaffolding all the way up from the water, which would have been slow and deadly in that valley, Smith built the span out from each side as a cantilever, each arm reaching toward the middle, carrying its own weight until the two halves met in the open air. It was the first great cantilever railroad bridge built in America, and it made Smith a national name. The lesson he carried out of that Kentucky Valley was the same one he would carry into the Royal Gorge. When the ground will not help you, stop fighting the ground. Build out from the rock, and let the structure carry itself. The second name is James DeRemer. James Richard DeRemer was a Civil War veteran and a construction engineer for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. While Smith was solving the gorge, DeRemer was building something stranger. He was building forts, dry-laid stone breastworks with gun ports cut into them, scattered up and down the Arkansas River, around 17 of them, meant to physically block a rival railroad from laying its own track. One of them, at a place called Spike Buck near Texas Creek, still carries his name. Fort DeRemer. These two engineers are the bookends of this story. One man building a way through, the other building walls to stop the other side. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button. Come back. To understand why grown men brought rifles to a railroad survey, you have to understand what was sitting at the top of the Arkansas River. The answer was silver, and the place was Leadville. In the late 1870s, the mining town of Leadville, Colorado, came up out of the mountains almost overnight. For years, prospectors there had cursed a heavy black sand that clogged their gold pans. Then somebody finally assayed that sand and found it carried about 15 ounces of silver to the ton. The black sand they had been throwing away was silver ore. In the spring of 1878, the big loads opened up, and the Colorado silver boom was on. A storekeeper named Horace Tabor, who had just been elected the first mayor of Leadville, grub-staked two broke prospectors named August Reich and George Hook, staking them a little food and supplies in exchange for a share of whatever they found. What they found was the Little Pittsburgh mine on Friar Hill, and it made Tabor one of the greatest and most sudden fortunes in American history. The numbers are hard to believe. Leadville's mines turned out about $2 million in silver and lead in 1878, and more than $9 million the very next year. Over the following decade, the district would produce more than $80 million in ore. The town itself swelled from around 1,500 people in 1879 to more than 30,000 by the summer of 1880, which made Leadville the second largest city in all of Colorado, behind only Denver. 30,000 people, 2 miles up in the Rocky Mountains, all of them needing food, lumber, machinery, and a way to ship the silver out. A camp that size, that high, was hungry for a railroad in a way few places in America have ever been. And there was only one practical way up to them along that river. It ran straight through the Royal Gorge. The Royal Gorge is a chasm about 6 miles long. The granite walls drop almost vertically to the Arkansas River, in some places more than 1,000 feet down, by some measures as much as 1,250 feet. At the narrowest point, the gap between the two walls is only about 30 feet wide, and the river takes up nearly all of it. Through most of the gorge, a crew could blast and chisel a shelf into the rock for a single line of track. But at that one pinch point near the lower end, there was no shelf to cut and no floor to stand on. The river owned the bottom of the canyon completely. Whoever wanted the silver of Leadville had to get past that 30-foot gap, and there was only room in the gorge for one railroad, not two. That single fact, one slot of rock wide enough for one line and not a foot more, is the whole reason this turned into a war instead of a race. It is worth understanding what building through the rest of that gorge took before we even get to the famous gap. For 6 miles, the railroad had to carve a shelf for the track out of the canyon wall, blasting a roadbed into solid rock a few feet at a time with black powder and hand steel, often with the river licking at the workers' boots. The stone here is some of the oldest and hardest in Colorado, ancient granite and gneiss, the kind of rock that turns a drill dull in an afternoon. Crews were lowered on ropes to set their charges in the cliff face, then hauled up before the blast. The Arkansas itself, fed by snowmelt off the highest peaks in the Rockies, could rise fast and run brown and violent in the spring, and it gave the men no margin for a slip. So by the time Smith's crews reached the 30-foot pinch point, the railroad had already spent months and lives just getting there. The hanging bridge was the hardest single problem in the gorge, but the whole gorge was a problem, mile after mile of it, and the bridge sat at the center of it like the keystone of the entire fight. 2 railroads looked at that gap and both decided they had to have it. One was the Denver and Rio Grande, founded back in 1870 by a Civil War general named William Jackson Palmer, a narrow gauge line built on rails only 3 feet apart so it could thread the tight curves of the mountains. The other was the much larger Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, pushing in from the east with deeper pockets and standard gauge ambitions. Both had crews near Canyon City. Both wanted Leadville, and the law had not yet settled who held the right to the gorge. So the 2 companies simply raced to seize the ground first, on the old frontier theory that whoever held the dirt would hold the route. The Santa Fe moved fastest. On the 18th of April, 1878, Santa Fe work teams threw their equipment down at the mouth of the Royal Gorge, just west of Canyon City, and started grading a roadbed before the Denver and Rio Grande even understood what was happening. Possession of the actual ground, they believed, would decide who owned the route. The Denver and Rio Grande scrambled crews up the canyon to grade their own line in the same narrow space, sometimes within sight of the other company's men. And that is when this stopped looking like railroad construction and started looking like a war. This is the ambient war that sits behind every rivet of Smith's Bridge, so let me tell it plainly. The Denver and Rio Grande sent James DeReamer up the canyon to fortify it. He laid up his dry stone breastworks at the choke points, the narrow places where one armed crew could physically stop another from passing, and he cut gun ports into the walls of them. Up and down the Arkansas, these little forts went up, maybe 17 in all. Crews working on the cliffs above would roll boulders down on the crews working below. Men threw each other's tools into the river. Survey stakes were pulled up in the dark. Picks and shovels worked next to loaded rifles. It was sabotage and standoff in one of the most dangerous canyons in the country, all over who got to lay a single line of 3-foot track. For more than a year, the gorge was less a construction site than a contested border. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. The Santa Fe decided it needed professional fighting men, and here the story collects some of the most famous names in the history of the American West. In March of 1879, the Santa Fe hired Bat Masterson, then the sheriff of Ford County, Kansas, to protect its interests. Masterson did not come alone. He brought in something like 60 or 70 hired guns, and the recruiting pulled in names that sound made up, but were entirely real. Doc Holliday helped find men. Ben Thompson came. So did two gunfighters remembered as Dirty Dave Rudabaugh and Mysterious Dave Mather. A railroad right-of-way dispute now had a small private army on its payroll, and the men holding the picks in the gorge were working in the shadow of hired killers. The fighting came to a head in June of 1879. The courts had been wrestling over the gorge for more than a year, and in the spring, the Supreme Court of the United States had handed the Denver and Rio Grande the primary right to build through the canyon. Then on the 10th of June, a local court issued an injunction restraining the Santa Fe from operating on Denver and Rio Grande track. The very next day, Denver and Rio Grande crews moved to take their railroad back by force, seizing depots and stations down the line. Bat Masterson and around 60 of his men loaded onto a special train and rushed to Pueblo, where they dug into the Santa Fe roundhouse, the strongest defensible building they had, and prepared for a fight. For a few tense days, an industrial dispute in the state of Colorado looked exactly like a siege, with an armed garrison holed up in a railroad roundhouse and gunfire reported in the streets. When it was over, a handful of men were dead across the length of the whole conflict, and the Santa Fe's grip on the gorge had finally been broken loose by the courts and by the men on the ground. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to turn this into a story about villains in boardrooms, and that is not quite what it was. The men actually swinging picks in the gorge were laborers, many of them immigrants and out-of-work miners, doing some of the most dangerous work in America for a day's wage, while two companies fought over whether their work would even count for anything. The real villain in this story is not a person at all. It is the gorge itself, that 30-foot slot of granite and rushing water. And it is the doubt, the very real possibility, that all of this blasting and fighting and dying would end with no railroad at all. That is the pressure Charles Shaler Smith was working under when he was handed the single worst piece of ground in the entire canyon. Picture the spot the way Smith first saw it. The walls have closed in to about 30 feet. The Arkansas River is moving fast and cold across that whole width, swollen with snowmelt in the spring. There is no bank. There is no ledge wide enough for a roadbed. You cannot simply blast a shelf into the wall here, because on the riverside, the rock drops straight down into the water and there is nothing to carry a track. The old idea, the obvious idea, was to dam or divert the river and build a stone causeway along the bottom. But that would have cost a fortune and eaten months that the railroad did not have, with a rival company grading toward the same gap. A diversion might have washed out with the next spring flood and taken the whole investment with it. Smith looked at it and decided to stop thinking about it as a roadbed problem. He chose to think about it as a bridge problem. If you cannot put the track on the ground, then you hang the track in the air, and you brace it against the only thing in that canyon strong enough to hold it: the canyon itself. Before I tell you what happened next, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories unless enough people click. One click. Come back? Here is what Smith designed, and it is so simple in its idea that it almost hides how daring it really was. He built a steel plate girder 175 feet long to carry the track across the pinch point. A plate girder is a deep beam built up out of flat plates and angle iron riveted together, strong enough to carry the pounding weight of a locomotive. On the inside, against one canyon wall, that girder could rest on the narrow shelf of rock that did exist. But the outer edge of the track, the side hanging out over the river, had nothing at all beneath it. So Smith held that outer edge up from above. He set a pair of heavy iron girders rising at an angle, anchored hard into the solid granite of both canyon walls and leaning in toward each other until they met over the middle of the track, like the two strokes of the letter A. That A-frame caught the weight of the outer rail and threw it sideways and upward into the rock walls. The river carried none of it. The mountain carried all of it. It is one of the rare pieces of engineering that you can understand in a single sentence and still find hard to believe when you see it. When it was finished, only about 1/10 of that long plate girder was actually sitting on solid ground. The other 90% of the hanging bridge was suspended in open air over the Arkansas River, held up by iron wedged against stone. A locomotive weighing many tons would roll out across moving water on a track that touched the earth at only one edge, leaning on an iron A braced into the canyon. And it held. Years later, the bridge was reinforced and strengthened, so the balance shifted closer to half on the rock and half over the water. But the original idea never changed in almost a century and a half. The mountain holds the train. There is one more chapter to the bridge itself that most people skip, and it matters. The Denver and Rio Grande had built its line through the mountains on narrow gauge, rails only 3 feet apart, light and nimble for the tight curves. But narrow gauge could not easily trade cars with the rest of the country's standard railroads, and as the traffic grew, the company gave it up. Between about 1888 and 1890, the Denver and Rio Grande widened its main line to standard gauge, 4 feet 8.5 inches between the rails, the same as nearly every other railroad in America. Standard gauge meant heavier locomotives and heavier loads, more than the original hanging bridge had been built to carry. So the bridge was reinforced. Crews added support beneath the plate girder to take the new weight, and over time, the balance shifted. Where the original bridge had hung about 9/10 of its length over open water, the reinforced bridge came to rest something closer to half on the rock and half over the river. They did not replace Smith's bridge. They strengthened it and kept running trains across it, which is about the highest compliment one engineer's work can be paid by the engineers who come after. Now here is the number that stops me every time I read it. This piece of engineering, the thing that solved a problem 2 railroads had gone to war over, was built for $11,759. That is the figure that comes down to us in the record. A few $1,000s of iron and labor to cross the one gap that all the money and all the gunfire in Colorado could not cross any other way. Set that small number next to the millions the 2 railroads spent fighting, and the contrast tells you something about the difference between force and ingenuity. Smith had spent his whole life learning to do more with less, ever since he was a 16-year-old boy with no father, no mother, and no schooling, carrying a rod across survey lines for other men. The hanging bridge is what that lifetime of hard, self-taught engineering looks like when it finally meets a truly impossible problem. Think about the sequence of it. Before the girder could go in, men had to get out over the river to cut the anchor seats into the rock, and there was nowhere to stand. They worked from timber, falsework, and rope, drilling the holes for the anchor bolts by hand. 2 men to a drill, one turning the steel and one swinging the hammer, in a canyon where a dropped tool fell a long way into cold water. They set the great iron legs of the A-frame into those seats and wedged them home against the granite. Only then could the long plate girder be floated out, piece by riveted piece, and hung from the frame. Every rivet was heated in a forge, tossed up, caught, and hammered home before it cooled. There were no cranes worth the name down in that slot, no power tools, no way to bring heavy machinery to bear in a 30-foot gap already full of river. It was iron, muscle, black powder, and nerve in one of the least forgiving places in North America. The building of it was brutal, and this is where I have to be honest about how thin the record really is. We know Smith's name. We know DeRaymer's name. We do not know the names of the men who actually hung over that river on ropes and timber scaffolds to set the iron and drive the anchors into the granite. The ledger gives most of them no name, only a number, a day's wage, and a job. They worked with hand drills and black powder to cut the seats for the wall anchors. They worked above and beside a cold, fast river with nothing soft anywhere below them. They did it in a canyon where the other company's crews might roll a boulder down at any moment, or pull their stakes, or pitch their tools into the water. I think about those men far more than I think about either engineer. They are the reason the track is up there at all, and almost none of them got a single line in any history book. One quick note. I turned the full story into a book, Everything the Records Gave Me. If you want it, the link is in the description. While the iron was going up at the pinch point, the larger war was grinding to its end, and it did not end in the Gorge. It ended in courtrooms and in a boardroom in Boston. The legal fight over who owned the canyon climbed through the courts. The citizens and sheriffs along the line increasingly sided with the home company, the Denver and Rio Grande, and the armed crews and the hired guns slowly stood down. Early in 1880, the two companies signed the agreement history remembers as the Treaty of Boston, and by the end of March, the Denver and Rio Grande had its railroad back for good. The terms tell you who truly won the Gorge. The Denver and Rio Grande kept the route through the canyon. In exchange, it paid the Santa Fe well over $1 million for the grading and construction the Santa Fe had already done in the Gorge, the materials on hand, and the interest. A figure the sources put somewhere between $1.5 and $1.8 million. The Santa Fe agreed to give up its plans to reach Denver and Leadville, and the Denver and Rio Grande agreed in turn to stay out of certain territory the Santa Fe wanted for itself. So the narrow gauge line that William Jackson Palmer had been pushing through the mountains would be the one to carry the silver down. And the bridge that a Santa Fe engineer had designed ended up carrying Denver and Rio Grande trains, which is one of those quiet ironies the old records are full of. With the war finally settled and the bridge secure, the railroad did what all that money and blood had been for. Denver and Rio Grande crews drove the line on up the Arkansas through the Gorge and toward the high country, and on the 20th of July, 1880, the rails reached Leadville. The richest silver camp in the world was finally tied to the rest of the country by iron, and a great deal of that wealth came rolling back down through the Royal Gorge, out across the hanging bridge, on a track that touched the ground at only one edge. Everything the war had been about, the silver, the freight, the 30,000 people 2 miles up in the mountains, now crossed the river on Smith's iron. It is hard to overstate what that single line meant to Colorado. For the next decade, the Royal Gorge route was the lifeline of the Leadville district, carrying ore and bullion down out of the mountains and carrying everything a city of 30,000 needed back up: lumber, coal, machinery, food, and people. The whole silver economy of the High Rockies leaned on a stretch of 3-foot track threaded through a canyon, and on one short iron bridge that hung most of its length over a river. A camp that had been a scatter of tents and cabins a few years before was now tied by rail to Denver, to Pueblo, and through them to the rest of the United States. The bridge was small. What crossed it was not. For decades after, that hanging bridge was one of the most famous pieces of railroad in America. Passenger trains slowed down at the pinch point so travelers could lean out and look straight up the granite walls and straight down at the white water roaring under the track. In 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt himself rode through the Royal Gorge and stopped at the hanging bridge to take in the canyon. People came from all over the country just to feel a train roll out over the river on iron braced against the mountain. Half a century later, in 1929, somebody built a tourist suspension bridge for automobiles more than 1,000 feet directly above Smith's Railroad, and a lot of people now confuse the two. But the one that mattered, the one that the war was fought over and the silver crossed, is the low iron bridge down on the canyon floor, the one that actually carries the trains. And it still carries them. The line through the gorge changed hands many times over the years, and by the late 20th century, the heavy through traffic had moved elsewhere. In 1997, a group of local interests bought about 12 miles of track through the canyon to keep the route alive, and in May of 1999, they started running passenger trains again as the Royal Gorge Route Railroad. Today, a train still leaves the old depot in Canyon City and runs down along the Arkansas River, into the gorge, and out across Smith's Hanging Bridge, much as travelers did when Theodore Roosevelt rode through. The silver is long gone. The gunfighters are long gone. But you can still buy a ticket and feel a train roll out over the river on iron braced against the granite, which is a strange and wonderful thing to be able to say about a bridge designed in 1879. As for the two engineers, their stories close very differently. James DeReamer's forts did their job and then became relics almost the moment the fighting stopped. Once the war was over, nobody needed dry stone breastworks with gun ports along a peaceful railroad. The forts were robbed for their stone and worn down by weather until most of them disappeared. though the name Fort DeReamer still clings to that spot at Spike Buck near Texas Creek, a stubborn reminder that this railroad was once defended with rifles. DeReamer had built walls to stop a railroad, and the day the railroad was settled, his walls had no more reason to stand. Charles Shaler Smith's story is the opposite. He built a thing meant to last, and it lasted. He went on building great bridges across the country after the Royal Gorge, over the Missouri, over the Mississippi at Minneapolis, his spans crossing some of the largest rivers in North America. But he did not have long. See, Shaler Smith died in 1886, only about 7 years after he solved the Royal Gorge, still in his 40s, worn out early, the way so many of these hard-driving engineers were. He did not live to see most of the century of trains that would roll across his hanging bridge. The man who spent his entire life learning to put iron where iron could not go was gone before he turned 50. And the bridge stayed. That is the part that still amazes me. The Royal Gorge War is long over. The silver of Leadville played out and the boomtown shrank back into the mountains. Horace Tabor made and lost his fortune. William Jackson Palmer is gone, and Bat Masterson is gone, and Doc Holliday is gone, and DeReamer's 17 stone forts are scattered rubble. But the hanging bridge is still down there at the bottom of the gorge, still carrying trains out over the Arkansas River on iron wedged against the granite, almost a century and a half after a fatherless boy turned engineer figured out that if you cannot stand on the ground, you lean on the mountain instead. I keep coming back to the shape of that place. 30 feet of space between two walls. 1,000 feet of stone above it. A cold river filling the floor. And men with no names hanging over that water to drive the anchors. We remember the Silver Kings and the gunfighters and the generals because somebody bothered to write them down. We almost never remember the men who actually built the thing the gunfighters were fighting over. The ledger gave most of them no name, only a number. But every train that rolls across that hanging bridge is rolling across their work, and I have come to think that counts as a kind of monument, even with no names carved anywhere on it. Here's the thought I will leave you with, and you can tell me in the comments whether you think I have it right. We like to say the American West was won by the men with the guns, the lawmen and the gunfighters and the generals. I do not believe that anymore. I think the West was won by the men with the picks, the ones who hung a railroad inside a canyon 30 feet wide, while other men shot at each other around them, and then went to their graves without their names in a single book. The gunfighters decided who would own the Royal Gorge. The nameless men decided whether anyone could ever cross it. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.